Hello and welcome to The Bad Take. My name is Tamara.
And I'm Himal.
Today we have a special guest with us, and without further ado, I will let him introduce himself.
Aibuan, everybody. My name is Ajay Kamalakaran. I'm a writer based in Bombay, India. Yes, I still call it Bombay and not Mumbai. The new name, well, it's not so new anymore. I was actually born in Bombay, raised in the United States, in New York City, and made in Russia. So I say made in Russia because I've spent most of my adult life living in and out of Russia. And my first work of fiction, Globetrotting for Love and Other Stories from Sakhalin Island, was published in 2017. What's really special about the book is that it was written right here in Sri Lanka, in Mount Lavinia, and it's in many senses a Sri Lankan book more than it is an Indian book. And like Anton Chekhov, who incidentally lived on Sakhalin Island, he actually lived on Sakhalin Island and called the place hell. He called Sri Lanka, Ceylon at that time, as paradise on earth. So I tend to agree with Anton Chekhov that Ceylon and Sri Lanka is paradise for me, and I keep coming here very often.
So this is not your first time here?
No, I think it's crossed 20.
Right. So what attracts you? What brings you here, all this? Yeah.
Well, it's a great degree of comfort that I feel in this country, and I feel I blend in really well, and even culturally, I feel that I can be myself here and just be part of the crowd. And Sri Lanka has such an open society, and people are so welcoming. And if you really want to be Sri Lankan and you're not, well, they make you feel like you are. So it feels like that I'm coming home, and sometimes I get the feeling that I was born on the wrong side of the Park Strait.
Could you just talk us through your writing career briefly and your career as a journalist over the years?
Right. Now, I have a background in finance and banking, and this is something in our part of the world, in South Asia, at least I would say a generation back, your parents would persuade you to pursue a profession that they think is best for you. And when I wanted to actually be a writer or a journalist, my dad would tell me that journalists are nothing but a bunch of drunks who sit in the press club all day and do nothing constructive with life. He may not have been too far off with this evaluation when it comes to some people. Yeah. And then I said, well, I want to be a writer. And he said, well, writing is a hobby. It's not a profession. You can't live off it. And so I had a background in finance, and it's something that I really did not enjoy. And I chose really early on in my 20s to not do this and to just get into journalism. I started learning languages and tried to get some assignments in different countries. And this really worked for me because I moved to Sakhalin in 2003. The idea was very simple. With a friend of mine, we wanted to just travel across Russia, Kamchatka, Siberia, see the whole country. And a student visa would give me access, long-term access to a country that a tourist visa or a visitor's visa doesn't give. So I enrolled in university, and at the same time, I was freelancing for international publications. And because there was an oil boom, a newspaper to cater to the oil expats, was started at that time. So it was just it was serendipity. Basically, circumstances and situations came together at that time that really led, where one thing led to another. And and I did manage to see a lot of Russia, but these things came together and helped me in such a way. And by 2007, when I'd had enough of living in the end of the world, a place that's so isolated from the rest of the world, I moved to Moscow, and I worked for Reuters. Initially, I was a stringer for them, and a stringer is basically a freelance correspondent for them in the Russian Far East. And I was attached to the Moscow newsroom. And after that, I joined full-time. I worked for Reuters. I was responsible for the New York newsroom, the financial news coverage gets shifted to Bangalore at night. So I was responsible for shifting those operations to Bangalore because if somebody you have someone going to work in Bangalore at 8:30 in the morning when it's 11 p.m. in New York. So the guy in Bangalore is fresh. If he's familiar with the U.S. financial markets and knows what's going on, he can handle that equities file unless it's an emergency. And the reporters in the U.S. can sleep. So it was a great arrangement which suited everybody. So I had colleagues who'd work along with the New York newsroom from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. And here I was working from 8:30 to 5:30 and enjoying daylight in Bangalore. And after I worked for Reuters, I also worked briefly for a publication called Die Presse, based in Vienna. And basically, I missed Russia a lot. I really wanted to be associated with that country again. And then there was this publication called Russia Beyond the Headlines. It's now called Russia Beyond. And the aim, initially the idea behind this publication was to give the Russian side of the story, because unfortunately, when Western publications report on Russia, many of them don't give the opportunity for the Russian side to respond. So it's all about putting their own point of view. And now, of course, it's a publication that's just based on that just wants to promote Russian culture and in the best way it can, using technology. But when I was there, one of the main aims was to clear, in India and in most parts of South Asia, people still in 2011-12 thought Russia is the land of communism, mafia, and bread lines. People still believe that, even though those things were long gone. And the idea was to really show what Russia is about, and that helped. So I split my time between Moscow and Bombay during those years. And it was a great opportunity for me to see European Russia and to be a part of all that, because my Russian experience before that was restricted to the Far East, which is still my favorite part of the country. And I think people from Sri Lanka would really would enjoy the Russian Far East more than they would Central European Russia, because that's something that's done. And I see people here have this great sense of a spirit of exploration. They want to visit. From my experiences within South Asia, I think the most curious people in our part of the world are actually Sri Lankans. So they would really enjoy visiting those parts of Russia where, you'd be a novelty, right? If somebody looks at you and they wouldn't be able to tell where you're from, and if you say Sri Lanka, they'll say, oh my God, wow, that's the land of great tea and elephants. And this is something that I would really recommend more people do from this country.
In your experience, Ajay, how propagandistic has Russian journalism been lately, especially?
See, well, there are actually two sides to this. First of all, Russian propaganda is mainly intended for a very domestic audience. So if in the Russian language, if you watch Russian TV, which I don't very often, but they try, and Russia primarily is more concerned with what its own citizens think of the government. So there's a lot of internal propaganda on television, and there have been certain deaths of journalists, but many of these cases have been very sketchy, and they're not. It looks like the whole aim is to basically make it look like the government was responsible. In some cases, I think they were, but they weren't always. But the whole problem is, if the Russian government doesn't want people to know something through the press, they don't need to kill a journalist. They can just contact advertisers and tell them that, okay, you guys are going to have tax troubles or some other problems from us. And they put pressure on the editors and on the publications to not give out certain information that they don't want. So the real danger for journalists, I know I'm straying off topic here, but the real danger is not getting shot, but losing your job and not being unemployable. Now, internationally, there are certain Russian, there's an outlet called Russia Today, RT, which essentially has taken up the role of the Fox News for Russia. So if there's a shooting at Burger King where somebody was annoyed that they were getting poor service, then the headline will be "Anarchy in Philadelphia." So, but I think that unfortunately, because these outlets are actually they've been created in response to what the Western media has been doing for a very long time. So the point is, for example, when the United States wanted to invade Iraq in 2003, even the New York Times published an article claiming that weapons of mass destruction exist. Nobody questioned their narrative because you believe the New York Times, their credibility is unquestionable. But there have been several incidents where numbers have been exaggerated. There's been a lot, for example, when Clinton bombed Serbia in 1999. And the whole, initially they said 200,000 Kosovars were exterminated by the genocidal Serbs. That number, that number was used in publications like The Economist and stuff. And within a few weeks that came down to 20,000, then it came down to a few thousand. And the point is that Russian propaganda is in direct response to the West. Now, in certain areas where you have incredibly conflicting narratives, it's very difficult to know who to believe. For example, when the MH17 Malaysia Airlines flight was shot down over Donetsk in rebel-controlled territory in Ukraine, the point is the Russians insisted that the Ukrainians did it. Western countries immediately blamed Russia. In fact, within 15 minutes of the plane being shot down, you immediately had reports saying that a BUK system was used. And the point is that it's very difficult to, very few people know the truth of that. I don't know the truth, and I don't know what to believe from this, simply because you have these narratives. The United States has satellite data and imagery of everything that happens in the world. If they had the kind of evidence that would have really nailed those rebels, they would have presented it to the international community, but they haven't been able to do that. As for the Russian government, they put up this ridiculous news brief about what happened to the aircraft using photographs. But what was really funny was they showed that MH17 was a Boeing 777. And the images they showed was of a Malaysia Airlines 767. And, people were able to call that out. So some Russian people themselves wrote, "Dear Russian TV Channel 1, when you're actually indulging in propaganda and disinformation, can you at least try and be a little more careful when you do this?" But yes, this exists, but like I said, it's reactionary to what happens in the West, because you also have, for example, right now, this whole thing about Russian collusion in the U.S. Electoral process. I find that really funny because the United States has interfered everywhere and continues to do it. And then they act like that's a crime against humanity when you've actually, what happened to Allende in Chile? This was a case of a coup, disposing of a democratically elected prime minister to install Pinochet. And this is just one tiny example. When Bill Clinton in 1993 actually supported Boris Yeltsin, who undermined democracy in Russia, and they helped Boris Yeltsin win the election after when the parliament, there's an incident, I won't get too much into this, but the point is the US press was praising American foreign policy for getting their man Yeltsin back into power in Moscow. And the point is that you see the way, where we're heading here. So the fact that you can blame them for something, but the propaganda against Russia is very strong, and sometimes they feel the only way is to have a lot of counter-propaganda. And today I read an article somewhere which said that the Black Lives Matter movement is being sponsored by the Russians. I mean, I find certain things really hysterical. For example, they say Putin sponsored Le Pen in France, but he's also backing Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. So you're supporting one left-leaning person, one ultra-right, and they say his whole aim is to dismantle the EU. So he's just playing around with the democratic processes. But unfortunately, it's so difficult. And being an insider, a journalist, it's really difficult to understand what's true and what isn't. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, The Guardian published an article which said that one of Trump's key strategists actually met Julian Assange inside the Ecuadorian embassy. It was a completely false report, and The Guardian has been completely called out on all this, and they have not been able, they haven't commented on this. And that particular journalist has been caught for plagiarizing, and it just goes on and on. What I'm trying to say is that was another hit job, like the New York Times weapons of mass destruction. And I'm not a fan of Trump, and I understand for Putin to have someone like that in Washington, it's a PR victory for him, because for years Putin was the global bad guy according to the way people looked at things, and you have somebody who embarrasses the U.S. on a day in, day out basis. So there may be some, he benefits from it. But what I'm trying to say is, unfortunately, because newspapers and publications worldwide have pushed agendas, some of them driven by governments, some of them driven purely by the interests of advertisers, it's really difficult to have an objective opinion of what's what, because you don't know what is propaganda and what isn't. And there's a lot of it surrounding many incidents in the world right now. So it's really tough. But but I definitely believe that Russia does indulge in global propaganda as well.
Cool. You mentioned almost in passing earlier that you prefer to call Mumbai Bombay. What's up with that?
Okay, well, this is a dispute that goes back to a long time now. Historians have claimed that Mumbai was the original name and that the British couldn't pronounce it, and then there are some who claim that the first people, when the Portuguese came to Bombay, they called it Bombaia, and when it was gifted as dowry to the British changed Bombaia to Bombay. Now, the reason why I stick to the name Bombay is because Bombay is actually, it's more than a city. It's a concept. It represents India's most Western-oriented city, India's most liberal city. It's a place where people from conservative parts of India came and where they could live liberal lifestyles and keep an eye on the West. And this is a city where in the 1960s, Duke Ellington, jazz legend, performed in Bombay. So this was a city that was completely in the global map at that time, a very international city. Frank Sinatra actually sang the song "Come Fly With Me." He mentions there's a bar in far-off Bombay. It was a very vogue city, even during the time of the hippie trail, because once they actually came overland from Europe into India, they would come to Bombay. Now, what happened was the renaming of Bombay was a watershed moment in modern Indian history, because we from a country that has always absorbed the best influences from abroad, if we're moving inward and becoming more provincial, and this is a kind of sub-nationalism, because at the same time you're saying, okay, Mumbai belongs to the Marathi speaking people and it's our city, it belongs to us. If you don't want to speak Marathi, or if you don't want to call it Mumbai, then get out. And what it did was it set off a domino rally, because it went, the next city, Madras, was renamed Chennai. And I'm very fond of Tamil culture and Tamil people, but when they speak to somebody in English, they refer to Madras as Chennai, and they emphasize this. And when they talk to each other in Tamil, because I understand Tamil, they refer to it as Madras. So what I'm trying to say is this, and then Calcutta was renamed to Kolkata, and this is such a waste of money. And I find this repugnant, simply because what are you trying to do? You're wasting money, you're distracting the masses, you're pondering to a set of people and saying, okay, and you're creating, I believe these are steps to the balkanization of India. And people don't take this seriously enough, but so many places have been renamed. And it's funny because, okay, if people who are Marathi speakers want to call it Mumbai, they're free to do it. No Chinese person calls their country China when they speak in Chinese. They call it Zhongguo, and which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Russians refer to Russia as Россия, and in English it's Russia. So if you suddenly, tomorrow, if Russia was renamed to Россия, nobody would know what it is. So the point is, when you try and, in India, there is a great danger of balkanization. And these kind of measures do this. And you can tell a lot about a person depending on, by what they call Bombay, whether they call it Mumbai or Bombay. And you can tell because there's that element, because essentially Bombay is a liberal city. It belongs to the liberals. It always has been. And we've had mass migration from the hinterland of different parts of India. And these conservative people have moved in, and now they form the majority. But and this majoritarianism that this represents, that's what Mumbai is to me. And I want Bombay and all of India to be international. I want the best brains in the world to come to India. I want it to be a place that's a real hub of global activity. I don't want it to turn into some sort of inward-looking provincial, my city to be inward-looking and provincial, or my country to be, okay, we don't need anybody, and moving inward. I don't think the future lies in that. I'm an internationalist, so for me, that's why I call my city what I do.
I see your point about Mumbai. I'm going to call it Mumbai being a liberal hub.
Right.
But does that mean it needs to cling to what is essentially a colonial hangover because of that?
How do you know it's a colonial hangover? Because, like I said, the name itself comes from Bombaya and Bombay. And the point is, you have to understand.
But it's an anglicized word, right? It's
anglicized from Portuguese.
Okay.
Not from Marathi.
Right.
That's the first thing. The second thing is, the Bombay as a city itself was a creation of the British.
Right.
You had a few fishermen living off the creeks and off the mainland and stuff like that. But this is just another village. So what this does with this name Mumbai, it says it belongs to. It doesn't say it belongs to Indians. It says it belongs to this Marathi-speaking community, and that is where I have a problem. See, I mean, for example, what is a colonial hangover? I'll tell you is there's a city called Kanpur. I'm sure you've heard of it. It was called Cawnpore, Cawnpore. I mean, nobody ever referred to it as Cawnpur. So right after independence, it was renamed to Kanpur because that's what everybody called it. And that's what it is. It's Kanpur. But places like Calcutta, places like Bombay, no, I don't think it's really a colonial legacy to do this. And like I said, India should tread the path of cosmopolitanism. And you achieve nothing by renaming. The renaming spree has not stopped. There's a city called Allahabad, which has been renamed to Prayagraj. And this is a country where states are competing to construct the tallest statues in the world. You have the tallest statue in the world in Gujarat. So in Uttar Pradesh, you have a demagogue who wants to construct a statue of Rama from the Ramayana, Lord Ram, and make that taller. And we have in Maharashtra, basically off Bombay's Marine Drive, a statue coming up which wants to be taller than both of these. But the problem is the Sardar Patel statue in Gujarat has already been built, completely by the Chinese, by the way. And you have these two states that are waiting to see the architectural plan and to decide who gets the taller statue. I mean, what are we doing? I find this ridiculous. See, we don't need chauvinistic, regionalistic, nationalistic pride. I don't think that's a must, because nationalism essentially stands against, okay, I'm an Indian, I'm better than a Pakistani or Chinese person, and these are acts of chauvinism. We don't need to do this. And the basic point is, I'm not a fan of the British Empire. I read Shashi Tharoor's book, and even before then, I would recommend anybody who thinks the British were a bunch of benevolent people civilizing the world should just read George Orwell's Burmese Days. That is an absolutely brilliant book. And you'd understand he does it in a way that nobody else has done it since or before. So I'm not a fan of the British Empire, but at the same time, we can't forget that they were here. We can't forget, you can't just, you renamed Victoria Terminus into Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus. And the point is, you can't pretend that the British weren't here in Sri Lanka or in India. They were there. It's a part of history, and we need to reconcile ourselves to the fact that this happened, and it's a part of our history, and it's all right. I mean, it's something that just happened. Reconcile yourselves to it, but to try and pretend that this didn't happen, and I mean, I find this really ironic because the same people who want to remove every vestige of the empire in South Asia are the same people who ensure that their kids study in the UK, study in another Commonwealth Anglo-Saxon majority society. And so basically they don't follow what's good for the goose is good for the gander. No, it's all about, okay, you got in my country, in India, for example, you won't find a single top-level bureaucrat whose kids don't study or don't live or have lived in a Western country. So the point is they don't believe in the system themselves, and they make sure that their kids have security, etc. out west. And at the same time, they're lording over. It seems to me that colonialism and the legacy of the empire, it's still prevalent.
Havelock Road is now known as Sri Saddhananda. Sri Sambuddhata Jayanti Mahavath.
Oh, is it?
Which is quite a mouthful.
Right.
But still, I mean, I don't really think people use it, do they? I mean, when I refer to it, but I refer to it as
Havelock, right? Yeah. And it doesn't mean that we're pro-British. It just this is the name that was given. And when a British guy comes to India and says, "Oh, we built the city," I said, "Yes, using slave labor." What they did was the Marathi people and the others who built Bombay, who built those beautiful neo-Gothic ensemble, and which is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, along with the Art Deco buildings. It was basic. What would they give these people who were doing the labor? They would give them baht. That's a Marathi word for rice. Bath, which the British turned into baht, which you use bath here as well. Yeah. And that's what they'd be given a bowl of baht every night for this. So we know the legacy, but that doesn't mean that, at the end of the day, Victoria Terminus is the world's most beautiful railway station. Anybody who visits Bombay falls in love with that railway station. They think that this neo-Gothic masterpiece it's something you celebrate it. It's there right now. And I don't, the whole idea of going to this and saying, the Prince of Wales Museum was renamed to, again, Chhatrapati Shivaji. I mean, Shivaji was a great king, but you do his own legacy a disservice by renaming everything after him, the airports, a railway station, now the statue. And if you read about the history of this man, he was actually, his name is being misused in such a way in India. And I don't think we've come to terms with our colonial legacy anywhere in South Asia.
No, I actually agree with you that it's not worth the time.
Right. And the money.
Yeah. Because,
when you rename something, so much money is spent on this. You have to change boards, at least with official, like official publications, and you have to change street signs and the process to get this through and the bureaucratic work involved. I mean, in India, once they used renaming to score a political point. In the 1960s, the U.S. consulate in Calcutta is it's actually in Ho Chi Minh Sarani, Ho Chi Minh Street. So when the Vietnam War was going on, the communist government in West Bengal, to spite the Americans, renamed the street to Ho Chi Minh Sarani. So when the U.S., they have no choice, but their visiting cards, their stationery, their letterheads, the Consul General of the United States of America, Ho Chi Minh Sarani. So, when you want to prove a point like that, again, it's petty, I think, but that really really, because America and India really have not been the best of friends. Things are looking good now, but the point is, I just don't see the necessity to do this. And at the end of the day, we have grievances from the colonial period. We haven't completely come to terms with what has happened, especially in India. But it's so easy. 70 years after independence, blame the Brits. It's Britain's fault. I mean, there's a joke now that anytime something goes wrong, India's Prime Minister Modi blames Nehru. So India's first Prime Minister, who's really well respected here as well in Sri Lanka, as I've come to learn, and just blame him. And I say, wow. I mean, Nehru was such a great man. For the first 17 years of Indian independence, he was a Prime Minister of India, and more than 5 decades after his death, he still doesn't allow the government of India to work. So, the whole idea of blame, it's somebody's fault. If we don't live in the present moment and we don't look at how we can solve relevant, it's very simple. You distract somebody, rename the Havelock to something, rename Hungerford Street. I don't know if you have one here, but in Calcutta there's a Hungerford Street. That was most people don't know who this man was, but he was responsible for shooting the Indian mutineers in 1857. People don't know this, but what I'm trying to say is this is just, it's a distraction, it's a waste of money, and it doesn't improve. You live in the Havelock, and I don't think the traffic situation has improved after the renaming.
Yeah, I remember there was a bit of an outcry regarding Torrington. Independence Square used to be called Torrington Square, Torrington Avenue, and Torrington was the guy who killed Veerapuranappu. So people were not very happy with that, and now I don't think. I mean, people do still fairly use the word Torrington, but I remember a couple of years back there was this movement to not use the word Torrington and use Independence Square.
I think these things change with time, right? I mean, like I said, 10 years ago, if you said Mumbai somewhere at an airport, they'd be like, oh, Bombay. And now if I say I'm going to Bombay, in airport security, and they're like, oh, you mean Mumbai? I've had this in Korea, but in Sri Lanka, people still, thanks to the legacy of Bombay sweets, people still call it Bombay, and because of Bollywood, which no one's going to call Mollywood, they still use the term Bombay very widely here. And what's really funny is the Alliance Française, the French cultural center in Bombay, they call themselves Alliance Française de Bombay. When the Brits issue visas, they still say issued by the consulate in Bombay. No one's going to say that, okay, I refuse to go to Great Britain because you refuse to call my city Mumbai. I challenge someone to do that.
When choosing names, is there a tendency to favor names that are, I suppose, more majoritarian heritage?
It's unfortunately the trend right now, which is why I really like what France did when they housed people from slums into residential blocks, mainly with Algerians and Moroccans and stuff. They named neighborhoods after flowers, acacia, frangipani, and very nice sounding names, although the neighborhoods weren't that nice. But something like that is much better. And to an extent, for example,
a lot of the names here, I'm sorry to interrupt, a lot of the names here are very singular Buddhist in character, right?
Right.
A lot of the new names.
Sure. I mean, look, majoritarianism is a trend everywhere. Unfortunately, populism is really at its peak right now, and the world is swung heavily towards the right. So that is definitely a problem. But I think with names of places, see, for a long time, certain places have had a particular name. For example, in Bombay, you have an Elphinstone Road. It was renamed, the railway station was on the suburban railway. That stop was renamed to Prabhadevi. And that makes more sense because you take a taxi, you're actually going to a place called Prabhadevi. And Elphinstone Road it's nobody knows it as that, even though that name has existed for a long time. So naming it Prabhadevi is actually a good step because it's an indication of where the place is. If you're doing something, at least do something to make it easier for somebody. But by, in India, we have a problem of so many airports, schemes, bridges named after the Gandhi dynasty. Rajiv Gandhi this, Indira Gandhi that. And, of course, it's a great political tool to do this, because when you keep saying the Rajiv Gandhi airport or the Indira Gandhi airport or etc., because the dynasty continues to dominate that party, which is now in the opposition. What you're doing is you're giving away, free publicity to them. So, but the point is, look at, if you're going to rename something, if you absolutely have to do it, then look at convenience. But the idea of this majoritarianism, I think it's dangerous, because people say, for example, now there's a movement in India to try and get everybody to speak Hindi. It's not working. It's failing. And they say, but majority rules. If you don't want to speak Hindi, go to Pakistan. And I tell people that, I'm from Bombay. We speak Marathi, and my native language is Malayalam from Kerala. And I tell people nobody speaks Marathi or Malayalam in Pakistan, whereas Hindi and Urdu are basically the same language. One is Sanskritized, the other is Persianized. So if anybody would be more comfortable across the border, it would be a Hindi speaker. Not, Sala Madrasi, as they call South Indians. So the point is, majoritarianism is extremely dangerous, and the subcontinent was divided because of this. It was a political problem. It wasn't a case of one community being inflexible and the other going out of it. That's that's what we're taught. But if you really read deeply into this, so majoritarianism is extremely dangerous. But and I think that it has to be nipped in the bud. And honestly, if somebody, the Havelock had a social worker who did something to help people, fine, name it. If you really essentially have to do it, rename it after that person. But if you're doing it with the intention of intimidating minorities, then I don't think it's a good idea, because these are the things that really lead to rebellion at some point or the other. They're small things, but it's little things that lead up to something bigger.
So let's talk a little about your book, Ajay. I've read the book and I liked it, and this because I left a review of it as well. And
full disclosure, I haven't read the book, so I'm kind of like going in blind here.
You should.
So I'm gonna let Tamara carry this, basically.
Right. So what I noticed was this is a collection of short stories from Sakhalin Island, and what I noticed was all these stories had they have a lot of emotion in them. These people are going through something. Sometimes it's good times or bad times, but they are dealing with something that's very emotionally heavy, I think. So what brought you to write something like this? What you had a wealth of experience as a journalist. What brought you to write something like a collection of short stories?
Sakhalin Island is an extremely unique place. It is just north of Japan, and it takes 9 hours to fly from Moscow to Sakhalin. So in one country, of course, Russia has 11 time zones, so it's a really big country. Sakhalin has been a part of Russia since the 18th century, but there was a lot of Japanese influence. And the island is really at a crossroad of Asia and Russia. So it's right there in the Pacific Rim, but it's a place with a predominantly European culture. And the island was essentially isolated from the rest of, it's been isolated for a long time, but from 1945 till the collapse of the Soviet Union, no foreigners or non-residents of Sakhalin were allowed to visit the island. If you were a Soviet citizen, you could get special permission. And if you were a foreigner, it was basically off limits no matter what. And so people basically, generations there had no interactions with any non-Soviet citizen. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was oil and gas exploration there. So suddenly this island transformed into a place which had no foreigners to having the most number of foreigners after Moscow and St. Petersburg in Russia. So it was a cultural shock for both the people, the inhabitants of the island, and the foreigners who came and who've had no experience with Russia. And essentially, I lived in Sakhalin between 2003 and 2007, where I was the editor of a newspaper called the Sakhalin Times. I left Sakhalin in 2007, and I went back for the first time in 2013. So there was a big gap. And what I noticed was when I lived there, this was a place that was buzzing with activity, a new kind of life with expats and Russians mingling. And by 2013, the large expat presence was no longer there. The oil and gas projects were on stream, so you didn't need foreigners out there anymore, and the place completely changed. And the idea behind writing this book was I lived there during really interesting times, and I wanted to fictionalize those times and chronicle them so that people who go there would know what this place actually was. It's now, after I wrote the book, basically the place underwent another phase in development. So it's really a very beautiful place now. But at the same time, the excitement, the buzz, and being some sort of a global crossroad full of an international place, that's gone. So the idea was so that people who visit now will also have an idea of what it was. And those between 2000 and 2010, when so many expats and foreigners lived on the island, those were the most interesting days in the history of this island, because if you look at the isolation, geographical isolation, you're about an hour away from the international dateline. And then suddenly a place like that has Brits, Dutch, Indians, Americans, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, and it really turned into something that was really special at that point of time. So I wanted to write this book so that people could, revisit that magic even by not being there at that time.
Right. Tell us a little bit about the stories. Like, what kind of characters can we find here?
Well, you've got all kinds of characters. Essentially, the characters reflect the times that the book was set in. And many parts of, Russia in the early 2000s was just recovering from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the 1998 financial crisis. So a lot of people, you had immigrants there from places like Armenia who came to do the kind of jobs that the Russians who were newly becoming wealthy wouldn't do. You had Russian girls from small parts of the country who looked at finding a foreign husband. And I don't want to give away too much, but the characters essentially, these are people basically from completely diverse backgrounds who ended up just living in one common space. And it reflects that. It also reflects the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union on the average person, because not everybody could work for an oil and gas company or a company that serviced them. And so how life changed for people and what they had to deal with. I tried to look at that, the impact of both the oil boom and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and how a society transforms itself from being completely socialist to going to the other extreme, where there's no social security net of any kind. And these characters reflect those times, basically.
Right. And are these characters based on real people that you met, or real events?
Certain events in a small scale were real. There's one story about a lady who wants to kill her cheating husband, her alcoholic husband. And there was one particular, I got the idea for the story because one summer evening, it was quite late, it was around midnight, I was fast asleep, and I heard somebody screaming, "Get out of the car, get out of the car." And if this was New York, I could say, "Hey lady, shut up." But being the only foreigner in my building, if I could speak Russian at that time, obviously, but if I said something from my accent, she'd know that, okay, it's the foreigner who's asking me to shut up. So I tried saying shh a few times, and that didn't work. And then I woke up and went to my balcony to see what was going on. And I saw this larger-than-life drunk man who was he was too drunk to get out of a taxi. And I watched the whole incident that's described in the book about how the guy falls on grass and the woman gets her son to come out and they take him off like he's, somebody who's war wounded. And so there were incidents that took place, and there were cultural situations that I did witness, things that I read about in newspapers. So a lot of this is based on those kind of incidents. But at the same time, I had an ex-girlfriend threatened to sue me for defamation. She claimed that in one of the stories that I've caricaturized her, and that she'll take me to court because it's libel, it's defamation. And what was really funny was a common friend told her that if you do this, you'll make him famous in Russia, and people will actually believe that that person is you. So you'll spoil your own reputation. So I wouldn't advise it. So
Right.
she
That never happened.
well, yeah. So she backed off and she said she's going to write a book about a stupid Indian guy who moved all the way from Bombay and who was a complete loser, and a few adjectives. And it was funny because even something like that would also be good publicity for me. So I don't think I could lose in this situation. But of course, the story wasn't about her.
So was this character actually a caricature of this ex or no?
No, of
not at
course
all.
not. Absolutely not.
Okay, so you mentioned that you came to Sri Lanka to write this book. Was it because you found more peace here, or
Absolutely. I mean, the point is that what I also really like about Sri Lanka, see, I'm a morning person.
right?
So when I stayed in Mount Lavinia, I would get up around 4 o'clock in the morning and just run straight to the beach and take a sea bath or an ocean bath. And by the time while I'm actually in the water, I could hear the prayers from Buddhist temples, which start a little later than that, of course. And, at Colombo and many parts of Sri Lanka, the people wake up early. The activity start in Kandy. It's even earlier, and so for me, I was really in tune with this. I'm really fresh in the mornings, so the peace was a big factor, of course, because Colombo is far more peaceful than any of the big cities in our region, and also Mount Lavinia's beach. I mean, frankly, it is one of the best inner city beaches in the world. It's spotlessly clean. The water is clean enough to swim in. And you go there at 7:30 on a Monday, chances are you'll be one of 5 people there. Try doing that in Juhu or in Karachi or in Cox's Bazaar. It's next to impossible. So the peace definitely was the most important factor. But also, if you go away somewhere else, you push yourself because you're there for a limited time. I can't just come and stay here permanently like an Indian citizen can do in Nepal, for example. So when you come here and you're here for a limited time, the finance background kind of pushes me to focus on deadlines. So this having peace and at the same time knowing that I'm only here for a limited period of time tends to motivate me more. So, and I've written a novella which I hope it sees the light of day in September of 2019. And again, that book was written here. It was written in Kotte, a place which is even because in Mount Lavinia on weekends it turns into party zone, and there's no peace and quiet anymore. But Kotte is more conservative and it's quiet all the time. So I found a beautiful annex there with the really lovely garden, and that kind of helped me as well. I find peace here in Sri Lanka, and it's much easier for me to write when I'm here.
Right. So there could be people who have entertained the thought of writing their own books, or maybe getting into writing or journalism or whatever. So for their benefit, let's maybe talk a little bit about your writing process, how you approach writing, and this the first book that you wrote, Globetrotting for Love, was a collection of short stories. Why did you go for a collection of short stories as opposed to something else, maybe a novel?
It's simply because these short stories reflected a whole series of parallel lives that were that you could witness in Sakhalin at that point of time. And a lot of times these worlds didn't interact. When you write a longer story or a novel, they have to be linked all together in some way. And here these stories are just not connected, but they're happening at the same time. I mean, people who go to a nightclub and check out the barmaid there, they have no idea that, okay, maybe my colleague is probably interested in this woman and they're seeing each other outside. It was a small town, but there was nothing that could really link all of this together. So that was the reason, because these were all stories that needed to be told, which is why I chose short stories as a genre. As for novels, I mean, if you're going to get into writing, honestly, worldwide, novels are the preferred genre, because people really want something that'll keep them gripped for a long time. And this is what I hear in the publishing world, that novels do better than novellas and short stories.
So, like you said, I mean, these stories are based on the same place, the same island, but they're
Right.
different stories. So, how do you write them? Do you write all of them at a stretch, or do you write one and go back and edit it? What's the process?
See, it really depends, because the way I like what Ernest Hemingway said: to write, all you need is to get a typewriter and bleed. So it just comes out of. It depends on. Stories change. See, for example, I wrote a manuscript here, and I passed it on to 5 people who read a lot, and they told me that I'm mixing genres a little bit. Certain stories could be better in certain ways. Certain things don't make sense. So these people were able to assist me and help me make these stories better. And then you also have the opinion of the publishing house and their editors. Now, you notice some stories ended abruptly. That also may have had something to do with the fact that publishing houses look to save on paper and space and optimize these things. So then there are unfortunate cuts in these kind of things. So the whole process is, some people can just sit and write stories, and I know of people who've actually written novels, 400-page novel in 15 days, doing nothing else nonstop. But a lot of it, stories change because it's fiction. You have freedom to just imagine. For example, with this guy who I mentioned who was drunk and fell on the grass, I just imagined that, okay, this man must have met his wife at one particular point. I just imagined how they would have met, how their lives were when everything was going right in the Soviet Union before the Brezhnev era, and how things went south after that or during that. So, you sit and you visualize. And for me, for example, since I was writing this book here in Sri Lanka, so when I wrote about this woman who wants to kill her husband, she initially pondered over killing herself as well. There's a reference to cyanide and the Tamil Tigers. So there's always this, your surroundings also influence that. And as a mark of gratitude, I wanted to just have something there where there's some Sri Lanka mentioned, because it's a country that's often overlooked, being small. And so stories develop over, sometimes you can just, you feel inspired to just write something, and sometimes you need time, it needs many changes and stuff like that. But it's always good to have a set of people whose opinions you value. And for me, I mentioned in the acknowledgements about one Roberto Bertolaccio. He's my Italian professor, and he's read way more than people can in several lifetimes. And he pointed out, he said that, okay, if this is going to be an international book where people are more demanding, then you need changes. And I was very fortunate that this panel of people who don't know each other, one person from Russia, one person from Italy, one person from Sweden, they had common views on what needs to change. So that made things a lot easier. So you always seek feedback. that gives you a much better shot. Of course, there are people who believe that everything they write is just superb. It doesn't need any feedback. You're writing for yourself at the end of the day. So you may just want to feel, no, but for me, I always think, how do I really, entertain? The whole idea is to entertain. People talk about light reading and writing simple text, but that itself is a skill. Maya Angelou, the great American writer who passed away a few years ago, spoke about that. She said that it takes tremendous effort to be on the same page with the reader, where you, and I think the greatest writers, Marquez, Thomas Hardy, these are people who, their texts are simple, they're easy to read. When you write something which is, many people, and I've noticed this is a mistake that a lot of people do when they write books. They want to show off their convent school education or their university, where they studied. And see, how many journalists on Twitter with rather unimpressive portfolios will put alumnus of Columbia Journ, at the rate of Columbia Journ, to show off that, oh yeah, I studied in Columbia, as though that itself is an achievement that puts them apart from others. So a lot of people, when they write, I firmly believe that a person shouldn't have to open a dictionary every 5 minutes when they read something that I write. They shouldn't need a master's in literature to find hidden meanings in what I write. And I think journalists make the best writers. I mean, I know this is a very controversial statement to make, but Marquez, Hemingway, there was a great Swedish writer called Stig Dagerman. I highly recommend his books. He was also a journalist. So what happens is, when you're a journalist, you write for the masses. When you do that, you understand I think journalists understand the readers much better. And when you do that, I'm not taking away anything from people who write fancy, use fancy language and stuff. But the whole idea is, at the end of the day, of course, stories will be subject to interpretation. For example, there's a story in this book called In the Mean Streets of Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk. And this was a caricature of one of my best friends. And he knows it, and he had a good laugh, and he said, "What have you done to me?" And but the point is that even though he felt it was very unflattering, a lot of people who read that story were like, could this possibly be a real guy? And they found this character very attractive. So I told him, look, since it's an open secret about this, would you like to do a Facebook live session with me, or a video where we can do this? And he gladly did it. And then people who liked the story said, oh, wow, this guy's way hotter than you describe him in your book. So everybody was happy at the end of the day. But I mean, the point I'm trying to make here is simply that when you write at a particular level that people can understand you, and they don't have to, most people, when do most people read? Before going to bed. So if you read something that's really heavy, and with there are double, triple meanings all thrown into every sentence that you write, you're gonna either fall asleep, or you're gonna put that book away and say, okay, I will force myself to read it, because if I've read it, then I may look good in front of my friends. So when I take a vacation, I'll put out 2-3 hours, I'll read it, and then tell people. Exactly. And why do that? That's not me. So I obviously have a long way to go in terms of improving my language, developing more of a style, but it's never going to be something where someone reads this and says, what the hell was that guy talking about? I don't want that. I mean, even if that's appreciated more. So young writers, this is a common mistake that they make. They go way, the overuse of analogies, the overuse of thesauruses. I mean, words that are just not in common usage, and it's not a matter of pride, I think, for someone to use really high funda language, and I don't believe in that. I mean, I respect people who do that.
How do you strike a balance between overwriting or over-intellectualizing and dumbing down, basically?
Right. It's a very good question, because at the end of the day, it depends on what your aim is with the book that you write. if you really want it should be food for thought about life and stuff, then you shouldn't dumb it down. You should, okay, if this is your aim, that this is, there should be food for thought, maybe it's a better idea to keep it at a level which is maybe slightly above, I would say slightly above the understanding of a person who doesn't read regularly. I would go for that. But I don't believe in pulp fiction either. But at the same time, somebody who reviewed this book, I loved what he said, that my stories were deceptively simple. So here's the aim. You have, I think you may agree, Tamara, that there's a lot of food for thought in this as well, but it's not so obvious. It's not so obvious. You think when you Globetrotting for Love, the story itself, what I found was that girls who read it loved the character who cheated on so many men. They were like, oh, that's awesome. You mean here's a story where guys continue to get screwed and nothing happens to the woman? And people really like that. They're like, a lot of women, they found that, they found this kind of a person inspiring. And so the whole idea is people take different things out of, and guys who read it were like, oh, poor thing, poor guys, and and girls were like, oh, great, we love this person. And there's this story, the first story, The Cleaning Lady, and I mean, people loved that story so much that there were ideas to make a play, a monologue about this woman, and what this wasn't the intended effect, but we had a book event in Bhopal in India, the city which is known for that horrible tragedy that took place in '84. We had a book event there, and people were describing the cleaning lady as a model of patriotism. I thought that she was nuts when she called everybody else uncultured and uncivilized, and when she told the Armenian guys, I won't talk to you. But people were like, oh, see, she's so patriotic. She has old school values and she's holding on to those values. And I'm like, really? Is that how it came out? And I love that. Because you get these, when you get this kind of feedback from people and they see something that you didn't think existed there, it makes you think that, oh wow, there is something else there. But the whole idea for me with these stories was write every story purely from the point of view of the characters, without me interfering and without me passing judgment. Just stay away, let these characters talk for themselves, and you decide whether the guy who falls in love or kind of almost dates two sisters at the same time is he a creep? Is he a psycho? Or is he just somebody who has no control over his emotions? Or is he just, a Casanova? Let the reader decide that. And I also tried my best to put in a few twists and turns. And unfortunately, I seem to have pissed off a few English people with the stories that concern the Brits. They didn't like a term Gastarbeiter being used on a British person. Somebody reviewed this and said that's quite ironic. I mean, we're expats. We're not Gastarbeiters. We do the world a service. So that offended them, and somebody was very angry about characterization of a Londoner who uses words like blighty, chap, but the point is, I told this English lady that yes, but this man himself positions himself as a modern day Robert Clive, the person who was really the main character in the evil East India Company story. So this guy thought of himself as a modern day Robert Clive, and so obviously he's not a typical Londoner who may not use those kind of words and stuff. But it was very she found that offensive because it's highly implausible. And then, of course, when the Brits, when they do review books, superfluous usage of articles, lexical confusions, prepositional misuse, and I just laughed at that, and I thought, oh my God, was that what I was supposed to do? to make sure that a Wren and Martin grammar book's rules were completely adhered to. And the Americans laughed that off, and they said that, no, it's a question of being snooty. But I found that very amusing. But this great English woman, non-Londoner from Berkshire, it's the English language, right? It's not Berkshire like in America. Berkshire Hathaway is how they refer to it. But this is Berkshire. Also said that this was pacey and the characters were interesting, and went to the extent of comparing me to Chekhov, and it's something I feel very uncomfortable with, of course, because he was just someone I don't belong in the same sentence with.
So when you hear something like that, like when you hear the point of view of a reader which is completely different from what you had in mind about one of your characters, how do you take that? Do you find it shocking, or do you find it delightful? How do you deal with that?
It's very interesting, because the point is, my whole aim was to try and make it look like that I'm not assigning any judgment to any of these characters. So the cleaning lady who uses the dirty rag to, the same dirty rag that she used to mop the floors, used to quote unquote clean the Italian leather upholstery of a mafia man. The point is that I'm not passing judgment on either of those people. And when people find something else in these characters, and I realized one thing, that's a great thing, because we're all multifaceted. There's no plain black and white. And it's a nice thing to see that people see this from another point of view. People see this from a completely different perspective. And that's something that I really appreciate that. And of course, feedback is really wonderful. I mean, sometimes I've gotten feedback like, a person who's related to my neighbor told me, oh, this is such a nice and simple book that it needs to be made compulsory reading for 6th standard students. So I said, thank you very much. And I laughed, but it annoyed a lot of people. You realize that something like that is bullshit. But this superfluous article, I appreciate that, because you know where you can improve. But if someone just trashes you and says, oh, it's a piece of junk, I would laugh at it, because you know what, at the end of the day, if someone's going to give you such criticism, it means you've gotten under their skin so badly that they want to make such an attempt to insult you, and that's perfectly fine. For instance, Jawaharlal Nehru wrote this beautiful book called The Discovery of India, and a very famous writer in India once told me it's a big piece of junk. And I didn't agree with him, but I thought, okay, there's really nothing out there that you have universal acceptance of. There's nothing that exists like that. For example, there was this film in the 90s called The Titanic, and I thought it was horrible. But I know seemed to be the only person who didn't think that it was a very, shallow, flimsy film that completely destroys the concept of love, and that's what I thought. But a lot of people disagreed with me, and I was right in my way, they were right.
Just a quick question for the benefit of any aspiring writers listening to this. How did you make the transition from journalist to author? And also, did you take any writing courses in fiction writing?
Okay.
Do you have any training in fiction writing?
I absolutely have no training in fiction writing, and no journalism qualifications either. So it's journalism is really work in progress, and it's something you just learn on the job. Because I remember at Reuters recruiting people from prestigious journalism schools. And these were supposedly brilliant students, and they needed to be completely retrained from day one. So that's something. As for writing, to make this transition, well, it's not that difficult to do. It's something. See, when you're writing in journalism, you have to be so strict in sticking to facts, in verifying, and writing is freedom. You can just if when it's fiction, it's your imagination. Let it run wild. Write whatever that comes to your mind. You're not restricted. Journalism like I said, you're dealing with facts and you have to be extremely careful. When you're writing, who's to tell you what to do? It's a liberating feeling, I think, writing. So people who want to get into writing, I think the most important thing is, what do you want to achieve with what you're going to write? That is really important. For me, when I wrote this book, the whole aim was, of course, I wanted people to take this virtual journey to the Russian Far East, to another place and time. Because I love situational stories, novels, and think about what you really want to achieve from this book being out. And for me, when people they talk about this cleaning lady and make her a real hero and say that, oh wow, she's amazing, or some of the other women characters, and I've been labeled a feminist because apparently the women always end up getting the better of the guys in the book. It was really not deliberate. But when you get this kind of feedback, and when someone just enjoys what you write. This morning, I spent time with one of my mentors, Sibyl Wetesinghe, who's a living legend here. She's 90 years old, and she's been writing for decades. And she told me, she actually told me which stories that she really liked, what her favorites were, these characters. And that was wonderful. Someone who I respect so much, who's a mentor of mine, for her to tell me, it's a great feeling. So I feel that mission was accomplished from that point of view.
Last question, I guess. Thoughts on the Sri Lankan literary scene?
The Sri Lankan literary scene, I think, is really underrated. There's some excellent books that are being, that have been published out of Sri Lanka, and they don't get the kind of weightage and coverage that they deserve. Like, for instance, when last year we had the Sri Lanka launch of my book, it was a small event at the Russian Cultural Center in Colombo. I met some people who belong to the Russian Writers Circle of Colombo, and there's this writer who's now, he's won some, you probably have heard of him. His name is Ranjit Dharmakirti. And I read his books, which are excellent, and they're so relevant. I'm just sorry that these books aren't more widespread in India. It's only when one really big publisher picks up something and they have the distribution networks that books spread. There's an author I don't want to name, but I'm sure everybody knows who I'm talking about. Excellent writer, written great books, but is essentially a pervert. Plenty of sexually explicit stuff in his books, and those books can be found everywhere, and they deserve it. But at the same time, there's so many good writers here who've written, and what I do is I prefer going to the Sarasavis and Vijitaya bookshops when I find books that I won't find in India that have been published here, and some of them are absolute gems. They're great stories, they're great books, but I hear from my friends here that the publishing industry has been ruined by vanity publishers in this country. So if somebody wants to publish a book, publishers expect them to pay for the publishing costs, either through a buyback system of books for them. And the ones that don't take money with distribution, they say, okay, it's your job to distribute your books and your job to work with other bookstores and stuff like that. And unfortunately, in India, one author mastered this concept of vanity publishing, where he agreed to buy back 2,000 copies of a book that's published, and then distribute them and manipulate the Amazon system, where he'd do the buybacks through Amazon. So suddenly, when 2,000 copies of a book sell, they become overnight bestsellers. Then bookshops follow this. Now, many publishers in India want this, but here it's you still have a chance in India, although it's still highly competitive, of finding somebody who says, okay, we'll do this, we'll invest in this. But here, I see this, even though a lot of great writing doesn't get that coverage, and there's also a serious problem here. See, I heard of Martin Vikramasinghe from my friends here, but it's so difficult to find his books in English in bookstores. It's so difficult, and then the quality, you find books with so many typos, with spelling mistakes, and the quality of the paper isn't good. See, he's a treasure. And his books, should be promoted worldwide. See, this is a way of promoting Sri Lankan culture by making sure your literature, your films are spread around the world. And when for example, I buy DVDs of great Sri Lankan films and I screen them independently in different cities in Europe and in Russia because I want to promote this country. And I'm doing it just out of love for Sri Lanka. But there doesn't seem to be a concerted effort to build the immense soft power that this country can have. And with books and the literary scene, it's all connected. If people are more supportive of each other with books, and if the lesser known titles are promoted more widely, because I've read some great books and stories from here. I mentioned Ranjit's book. It's called The Lone Flower, and it's an absolutely beautiful story of a Sri Lankan going to Goa, and it's probably based on there's stories that are based on the writer's trips to India, and a completely fresh perspective that you'll never get from an Indian writer, because we take so much for granted there in terms, like you guys mentioned Jaipur today when we spoke off the mic, but what a beautiful city it is. But it's often people who are not from Jaipur, not from India, who really appreciate that city more. So, and there's one writer whose books, I found his collection of short stories way back in 2009, Ashok Ferry, and Ferry's not his real, it's a pen name. This good Ceylonese girl, I think that's the name of one of the stories, and that was brilliant. So much humor there. It's so funny, and I mean, honestly, I would want to see a book like that when somebody goes to a Sri Lankan embassy or high commission. Something should be, so that you have to promote these kind of books, because something like that really gives you a fantastic look at urban life in Sri Lanka, life in Colombo. And there are quite a few other books that I've read, which I know some of them have gotten this Gratian, is that how you pronounce it, Gratian Prize? But the point is, there has to be more of an effort, because honestly, it's very underrated, the literary scene here. I always end up buying a lot of books when I go from here. I end up reading all of them really quickly, there are a lot of really talented writers here, and I think they need to they don't have that kind of that support that they should have, and there should be more of a concerted effort to promote that. In fact, I met last year when my book was launched at the Russian Cultural Center. There's this Dr. W.A. Abhay. He's a bureaucrat who's written more than 80 books and translated the works of Hemingway, Kamala Das, many, many great writers into Sinhala. So some of his books are also really, really wonderful, but they don't have that kind of reach that they deserve. And this extends as well to how many people outside Sri Lanka have heard of, except those who live, breathe films, have heard of Lester J. Peters, who passed away recently, or even Prasanna Vithanage. Their films are outstanding. When you think of South Asia, the Bollywood pop movies, which I'm not a fan of, some of them are nice. They get all the attention, but the art cinema scene here is, again, very good. But the point is, I don't think Sri Lankans as a people do enough to promote their own country, their own culture. And it can be such a tremendous asset, in the long run, because you want quality tourists coming here. You want this, because this is a country full of intellectuals, and it can turn into some sort of an intellectual hub of I would say, of all of Asia. And you have the nature and the surroundings to support that. But there just doesn't seem to be this kind of I haven't met too many people who are on the same page with me when I talk about these kind of things. So that's how I would assess this.
Right. Okay. Before we sign off, I have one final question. Apart from your own book, what is the book, or it doesn't have to be one book. What is the book or books that you have gifted the most to other people?
Gifted the most? Let me think. Okay, I've gifted Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment in different languages to people. They really enjoy reading that. I've gifted a lot of Russian literature, Chekhov's books, Orhan Pamuk. I've gifted his books, and also lots of self-help books because it really does help. And I would just like to add one thing about my book. There are actually 3 signed copies. So for people who are listening to this, you're more than welcome to contact Tamara and Himal, and first come, first serve. Get your hands on this book, and I would be very happy if you wrote a review on Amazon or Goodreads. Let's just say it's a gentleman's or ladies' agreement where you do that. But you're more than welcome to contact them about that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I have read Ajay's book. Like I said, I enjoyed it immensely. And if any one of you out there want to get your hands on it, just let us know and we'll send you a copy. A signed copy, yes. So Ajay, where can people buy your book? Is it available in Sri Lanka or Amazon?
It is. It's available on Amazon, but I'm not sure about here in Sri Lanka. But there's a website called Sakhalin in Lanka.
Okay.
And it's not active. I think we need to restart it.
Right.
But you can buy the book from that site as well.
Right.
But Amazon should be selling it here as well, because it is available in many countries. And I've seen it in bookshops in Russia and Ukraine and Thailand and Nepal. And I haven't seen it in bookshops here yet, but there are ways, like I mentioned.
Right, sure. So where can people get in touch with you, contact you?
I have a Facebook fan page.
Right. We'll share links to all these in the show notes.
Fantastic. So you can get in touch with me through the Facebook fan page. I always respond to messages, to feedbacks, and once in a while when I get trolled, I somehow see humor in it and get back to people. So, messages like "you stupid Russian spy" and Putin's propagandist, and those things come to me as well. So Facebook, Twitter, and like I said, I've been coming here since 2002, and I'm always ready to expand the number of people that I know here and to interact more and to learn more, because I was in Jaffna just a few days ago, and it was my first trip and something that I immensely enjoyed.
Right. Okay, so Himal, do you have anything else to add?
So thanks a lot, Ajay, for coming and talking to us. And we hope our readers are lucky winners. How are we going to do this? Are they going to...
So we have 3 signed copies.
That's right. And so whoever gets in touch with you guys first, or
exactly,
as long as they agree to write a little review,
just let us know. Like the first 3 people will get the 3 copies.
All right, cool. Then catch you guys next time.
Yeah.
Peace.